All right, welcome everyone to our second webinar of our webinar series on the ethics of researching the far right. I'll start speaking now, but I'm sure a few more people will join us in the next few minutes. So I will be chairing the panel today. I'm Aurelian London. I'm one of the co-conveners of the Reactionary Politics Research Network, who is co-organizing this webinar series with CREX at the University of Oslo and the Center for Alternatives to Social and Economic Inequalities at the University of Lancaster. My co-conveners of this webinar series are Audrey Gagnon from CREX and Aaron Winter from CACEI and Lancaster University. So it's a pleasure to have you all here for this second webinar series. You can catch up on the first webinar on our YouTube channel, which we will circulate later on, but you can find us at the Reactionary Politics Research Network on YouTube. So the aim of this session really is to build on the co-edited book on the ethics of researching the far right that was published by Manchester University Press earlier this year, co-edited by Antonia Vaughan, John Brown, Megan Tinsley, and myself. The aim of the book was to kind of provide some reflections on how to actually deal and engage with far right politics. And really to kind of research this in a more kind of ethical manner. We have 3 speakers today. Unfortunately, Katie Brown is not able to join us because she's unwell, but don't worry, she will be coming back to another webinar later in the series. But we have 3 fantastic speakers, which means we will have a bit more time for the Q&A. Our 3 speakers in the orders in which they will be speaking are Omran Sharifi, George Newth, and Miranda Iossifidis. I'll introduce them all now, and then we will move through the 3 presentations, and then we will open up to questions. You are more than welcome, of course, to use the Q&A box if you want to ask any questions, and I will moderate them at the end and ask our speakers your questions. So please free to type whenever any question comes to mind. Our first speaker, therefore, is Omran Sharifi. Omran is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Communication Sciences at Vrije Universiteit, Brussels. Apologies for my accent in Flemish, where he's investigating how the far right engages with audiovisual fiction. Omran completed his PhD in politics at the University of York, where he examined the emergence of pro-Israeli far right parties in West Europe. His research interests include far-right studies, far-right ideology, German politics, and discourses about populism and anti-populism. His talk today will be on what the far-right is and isn't. George Newth is our second speaker, and he's a lecturer at the University of Bath. His research focuses principally on how far-right parties, attempt to normalize their reactionary politics via discourses of common sense. This links to broader research interests pertaining to the role of populism and nativism in far-right articulations of regionalist and nationalist politics. His book with Routledge, Fathers of the Lega, Populist Regionalism and Populist Nationalism in Historical Perspective, investigates the historical roots of the Italian Republic's oldest surviving political party, the populist far-right Lega Nord, or Lega, and formerly Lega Nord, tracing its history to post-war Italy. And finally, and George will be talking to us about racism and nativism. And finally, our final speaker is Miranda Iossifidis, who is a lecturer in sociology at Newcastle University. Her research interests are to do with speculative, populationist, and ecofascist futures, reproductive and climate justice, and creative and collaborative methods. And Miranda will be talking to us about ecofascism and the need for a wider approach to it. So that's the biographies for our 3 speakers. I'm not going to talk any longer because I'm sure that's not me you want to hear from, but our speakers. And our first speaker is Omran. Omran, the floor is yours if you want to share your slides. Go ahead.
Yeah, 1 second. So hopefully you can see the slides now.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Aurelian, and you've done me a job. You've done the job for me now. I don't have to kind of repeat who I am, but just in case, my name is Omran Sharifi, and I'm at the VUB. And I also don't speak very good Dutch, so I also have problems pronouncing the name of the university. But anyway, the title of my talk today is "What the Far Right Is and Isn't," and as Aurelian said, it's the first chapter in the wonderful edited volume The Ethics of Researching the Far Right, which was published earlier this year by Manchester University Press. So just to give you some background on why I wrote this chapter and what I was trying to do, I think a lot of us now would agree that the field of far-right studies is becoming increasingly saturated. There's more written about far-right parties than all other political party families combined. And I believe this carries a number of risks, one being that there's a risk of overlooking non-far-right politics, and I'll come to that in a second, and as well as inflating the importance of the far-right. So the goal of my chapter is to overcome what I believe are some common misconceptions. It's not an exhaustive list, and offer some clarity on how we might think of and conceptualize the far right. So I've broken down my chapter into four common misconceptions, and I think it's worth thinking about these when researching and talking about the far right. First of all, the idea that far right politics is not just far right party politics. In fact, far right parties are only a part of the picture. Second, that there's no black, white, yes, no, goodbye dichotomy, and the far right is not necessarily the single biggest or uniquely dangerous threat to democracy. Third, that the us and them of the far right is not fixed. Far right forces actually may look to defend the nation, but some talk about the West or Europe or the Western civilization. And finally, that the far right is not uniform, that there is actually a lot of a lot of variance between different far right parties, both within continents and between different continents, and also within far right organizations themselves. So, and my slides today are quite minimum, which hopefully is makes it a bit clearer what I'm trying to get at here. So the first shortcoming I identified was this idea that far right politics is not just far right party politics. And I think within media discourse and also within academic discourse, there's a tendency to conflate the two things. I would argue in academia, particularly in political science, this is partly because of the fact that electoral politics and voter preference are easily quantifiable and measurable, and also therefore fit this kind of dominant positivist paradigm, in the sense you can run quantitative analysis of electoral results and get quite nice papers out of it. But of course, this comes at a cost. I mean, it's obviously important to look at far right party politics, but there's more than that when we talk about the far right. There are far right intellectuals, some of them being quite influential. For example, one case that many people know about is the Nouvelle Droite in France, and their idea of a ethno-pluralism and a right to difference, which I think has now influenced lots of different far right actors. There are also far right street movements. Think of Pegida in Germany, EDL, the English Defence League in the UK. And these movements managed to shape the political agenda, although it without necessarily, and their success is not necessarily, you can't necessarily measure it at the ballot box. We also have, and I think in the Norwegian case, this is obviously quite clear, we also have acts of far right terrorism, which we can't forget about. And I think what comes from this is that by focusing only on far right party politics, we risk a situation where the success of far right parties is seen as a weather vane for the risk posed by extremist and racist ideas. Whereas in fact, far right ideas can prosper without any successful far right party or a party designated as such. And in fact, you might have a situation where a far right party does not do very well at the ballot box, but its ideas actually prosper under a new guise, which may in fact even be more problematic. So second, there's no good-bad dichotomy or binary between the far right and non-far right. And while, as I write in the chapter, it's fully understandable that people are concerned about the success of the far right, I think it's equally important not to depict the far right as uniquely or the only threat to democracy or our way of life. I think we see this in the unintended, the undoubtedly well-intended relief shown when far right parties lose electoral support. But often this happens when the non-far right, the so-called mainstream, adopt the policies that the far right is pushing. And the question is, if the designated far right party loses, but its ideas win under a new, more acceptable guise, is this not something of a hollow victory? Now, combined with this binary of saying that there's a far right and a non-far right, this can also inadvertently perhaps lend legitimacy to the on the far right by allowing the far right to portray itself as the only opposition, as the only alternative to business as usual. At the same time, this binary, I think, also allows the non-far right to get away with perhaps equally dangerous policies under the guise that the mainstream somehow inherently poses less danger. So the idea what I'm trying to argue here is that it's not just that the far right party politics doesn't always come with this kind of clearly identified label, and that in fact it would be a mistake to believe that only designated far right politicians or actors are the ones guilty of propagating far right ideas, whether it be racism, sexism, or other forms of exclusionary politics. Now, the third misconception is the idea of the us and them, the idea that far right parties will always look the same and always sound the same. Now, in terms of, and there's actually been, I think, in recent years, a shift in terms of who belongs to them and who belongs to us, or supposedly. Now, in terms of the far right to them, the Jew had long been the special enemy of the European far right, but I think we've seen now in recent decades that it's much more common to hear European far right politicians and actors targeting Muslims in their public discourse. In fact, we've seen in some parts of West Europe, some far right actors trying to reach out to Jewish communities, and talking of some kind of Judeo-Christian West or Europe. And also come back to link to that, trying to portray themselves as the biggest opponents of anti-Semitism, conveniently portrayed as an imported phenomenon brought into Europe by Muslim immigrants. But what this shows is that there is that these actors are willing to construct an us, perhaps cynically and strategically, but are willing to construct an us that doesn't align with conceptions of how the far right thinks of us. So it's not just about the nation; it can be about the West, it can be about Europe, it can be about Western civilizations, and we also see this kind of inclusion of groups that you would not perhaps instinctively associate with the far right, whether it's different gay and queer communities or different migrant communities. Again, trying to kind of, and this shows that there is a flexibility in who belongs to them, but also who belongs to us. And I think we have to be aware of this and not always assume that far right politics will always manifest itself in the same way, regardless of place and context. And then the fourth misconception or issue that I think is worth reflecting on is this idea that the far right is not uniform. And while it's common, and perhaps I'm making the same mistake here slightly in my presentation, while it's common to think of the far right, what we're in fact dealing with is a relatively diverse group of actors, organizations, and ideas. Now we see this within the literature, and this common distinction made between radical and extreme right parties. The idea that radical right parties are more moderate or more contemporary, and extreme right parties subscribe to a more traditional far right worldview. And while we can be skeptical of this division, it shows that there is an acceptance that the far right is not uniform. There are different parties that adopt different strategies, that speak differently, look differently, and also will organize in different ways. Beyond that, there's also internal division, whether it's a far right organization or party or whatever it may be. These are not uniform bodies. I think the AfD in Germany is a good example, that you can see that there are different wings, some more or less extreme, if you like, if it's possible to say that, but also subscribing to different worldviews on the role of the market, economy, some being perhaps more in favor of trade unions, some being less in favor of trade unions. So there's also this internal division. And while there's division within the far right, there's also division between different far right organizations. Think of the European Parliament, where you have a number of groups now that would be classed as far right within this umbrella term, but in actual fact, they don't see eye to eye on lots of issues and are often at loggerheads with one another. So, and there's a slight kind of caveat here. I think there's some difficulty in thinking about this idea, or maybe there's a risk of overemphasizing how diverse the far right is, and perhaps also losing sight of what unites these different actors, ideas, and parties on a deeper level, which I think is something that I don't fully fully manage to answer in my chapter, but I think it's something we should also be attentive to when researching and writing about the far right. So, in summary, far-right parties are only part of the picture. They also exist alongside intellectuals, street movements, and terrorists, among other organizations. Not only those demarcated as far-right promote or implement extremist, racist, and exclusionary politics. Though the logic might be the same, who belongs to the far-right, us and them will change. Far-right politics will not manifest itself uniformly over time and space, and we do see a great deal of variation. This is also something I looked at in my PhD with the pro-Israel far-right in West Europe. And finally, there is no singular far-right. The far-right may not always sound or look far-right if we think of the far-right in this kind of traditional classic sense as kind of neo-Nazi skinheads going on the streets, violently beating up their opponents. So I think what my chapter argues in my presentation today is that this idea that reflective and critical research on the far-right needs to highlight what is unique, in particular about the far-right, without overlooking similarities with other groups, be it the non-far-right, if you like. We need to be aware of variation within the far-right without losing sight of what unites it. Furthermore, we should be attentive that history will not always repeat itself identically, and that far-right actors may even represent or work for non-far-right parties and organizations. So I'll leave it there, but I look forward to your questions and comments, and thanks for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Omran. If you have any questions, of course, please keep in mind that there's the Q&A that you should be able to use at the bottom. I hope it's working, as I haven't seen any questions yet. So if someone wants to say hello, that'd be great, just so that I know it's working for sure. Thank you so much, Omran, for your presentation. I love that chapter. It's so incredibly clear, and I think your presentation was very useful. Thank you. Someone said hello in the Q&A, so I know it's working. Okay, so yeah, if you have any questions, please do feel free to type them now or type them at the end. But we are going to move on to our second speaker, who is George Newth from the University of Bath, who will talk to us more about racism and nativism and the Lega/Lega Nord. So George, the floor is yours, and we can see your slides. So.
Great, good to hear. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to the organisers of this webinar. It's great to be following on from Omran's talk, because Lega, who I'm going to be talking about today, what I'm going to be talking about today, is really a classic example that the far right is far from uniform. So the party I'm talking about is the Italian Republic's oldest surviving political party. My imperfect definition for this party is far right, and at a push, populist far right. So it's far right insofar as it's always espoused a racist ideology, while also focusing on a politics of exclusion against other marginalized groups. So this is drawing on definitions from Aurelia Mondon, Aaron Winter, and Katie Brown. And a secondary feature of the party's politics is populist, only insofar as its politics have sometimes been framed around a people versus elites discourse. So a little bit of context. The Lega was formed in 1991 by Umberto Bossi as a merger of different northern regionalist leagues. And between 1991 and 2013, kind of really campaigned for different iterations of autonomy until Bossi's resignation. So different iterations of autonomy from Rome for the North. Under his successor, Matteo Salvini, the party underwent a gradual, yet steady transformation from a regionalist to a nationalist party between 2013 and 2017. The relative ease with which the Lega changed its identity is in part an example, of how regionalism and nationalism can be viewed as two sides of the same coin, but also how the Lega has consistently been a far-right and a racist party. So the Lega has always defined the region and the nation in ethnic and racial terms, leading to the cultural and physical racialization of a series of outgroups, be that Southern Italians depicted as lazy good-for-nothings, siphoning off the hard-working people of the North, or a racialization of Muslims as a threat to Italian security and identity, and a depiction of immigration as an invasion. All of these things have been constants in the Lega from Bossi to Salvini. So it therefore seems strange that racism has been largely absent from analyses of the Lega There are some notable exceptions, of course, including that of Anna Centobull's 1996 paper, which analysed how a racialization of both northern and southern Italians was key to the Lega's ethno-regionalist claims. However, by and large, such approaches have been the exception, which proves the rule of a preference of the term populism over that of racism to define the Lega. My research is far from exempt from this ethical quandary, which is why I've used it to highlight some key ethical issues. As I stated here, my research questions, and I say in the chapter, my research questions for my PhD did not contain the words race or racism and focused predominantly on regionalism, nationalism, and populism. And indeed, even my book, the title, Populist Regionalism, Populist Nationalism in Historical Perspective, even though I examine the key issues of racism in the book, the title itself leaves out the word racism. And this raises significant ethical questions, not least because Salvini, alongside other far-right politicians, is rather fond of being called a populist. We see him here wearing a t-shirt saying, "Sono un populista," I am a populist. This is common amongst far-right politicians who, on the contrary, when called racist or fascist, threaten to sue those who do so. So for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to draw on my experience of researching the Lega and reflect on why racism has been largely absent in political science analyses in particular of this party. I'll then offer 3 suggestions for critical and ethical engagement with the far right in general. So one of the key reasons for an absence of racism as an analytical tool while studying the Lega is a prevailing whiteness in political science and Italian studies as well. So there has been much scholarly work dedicated to the role of the Lega, both as an opposition party, a protest party, and while in government, and its core campaign issues of federalism, regionalism, latterly nationalism. But this has largely come at the expense of an analysis of how racism and far-right ideology are articulated via such issues, and how this relates to the Lega's role in the mainstream of Italian politics. Now, my early work is no exception to this, as I mentioned, and can probably be put down to 2 main reasons. First, to meet the demands of gatekeepers, I used existing paradigms without feeling able to question their accuracy, precision, and/or whiteness in methodological terms. Second, as a white cis male researcher, I have not been at the sharp end of the Lega's racist discourse and ideology, and did not think intersectionally enough in my early approaches. Linked to this first point is a narrow interpretation of the far right and the fact that, not acknowledging that the far right is not uniform. So the prevailing association of regionalism and sub-state nationalism with more progressive forms of politics has led people to analyze the Lega's right-wing politics as kind of right-wing turns as kind of exceptions rather than the rule of its ideology. We can see this in the fact that many scholars tended to interpret the Lega as far-right only after its adoption of secessionist policies and when it started campaigning for a separate North Italian state and started adopting more nationalist paradigms. And also when it started adopting a more Eurosceptic position from 1998 onwards, whereas before it kind of been more pro-EU, albeit from a more pragmatic sense of wanting more autonomy for the North. The Lega's claims to be anti-fascist, for example, I've included this poster here of a 1980s poster from the Lega Lombarda, which was a precursor to the Lega Nord, which is Bossi comparing Jean-Marie Le Pen to the Roman parties, saying that the Roman parties are fascist, just like Le Pen. So trying to distance himself from fascism. But this is really just a ruse to deflect accusations of racism and claim to be a victim of racism from the Italian state. And indeed, towards the end of 2017, Bossi actually tried to reassert this supposed anti-fascist identity, claiming that Matteo Salvini had gone too far in his defense of neo-Nazi skinheads who had attacked a pro-migrant organization. But of course, the party had begun forming connections with the extreme right long before Salvini took the reins of the organization. Finally, in terms of terminology, populism and nativism have both been used as proxy terms for racism when defining the Lega. Recent work on the Lega has even asserted that populism is still the defining feature of this party. In terms of nativism, scholarship on the Lega reflects a damaging trend in mainstreaming understandings of nativism, which I've highlighted in a separate article, in which nativism is considered either race neutral or even non-racist, thus underestimating the process of racialization, which juxtaposes the native against the non-native. So while the Lega is a useful case study, the reflections here are not strictly limited to this party. And what follows are three tentative, non-prescriptive guidelines to encourage reflexivity, and perhaps a less euphemizing way to referring to the far and extreme right. So the first point requires reflection on how, the first point, relates to a kind of a less euphemizing, a less euphemistic way of referring to the far right, and reflection on how we interpret concepts, and a critical examination of the euphemistic qualities of terms such as nativist and populist. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily discarding these terms, but rather being clear about their role in both mainstream and far right politics. Ideally, paradigms examining the far right should be, or should strive to be, anti-racist and actively stigmatize the far right as well as defining it. Now, as I've already mentioned, this is more difficult for early career scholars trying to make their way in the field. And so I would say the onus is not just on the researcher or writer, but also gatekeepers such as reviewers, who need to become more open to critical and experimental approaches from colleagues, especially early career colleagues who may wish to challenge hegemonic definitions. Secondly, political science has never been and can never be, and academia in general has never been and can never be, a value-free discipline. So reflecting on a positionality, such as how our identities may impact our production of knowledge, is important. However, also expanding beyond the boundaries of our own discipline can help us as scholars to operationalize a new criticality as well. So, for example, I've more recently started using racism to analyze the Lega, but I would not have been able to understand this or expand my knowledge on the processes of racism and racialization without engaging with colleagues' work in sociology, for example. And this also links to the need to focus on the role of discourse and looking at how both the far right discursively constructs its ideology and its politics, while also examining the role of the mainstream in normalizing these ideas. And I think Katie Brown's methodological work combining critical discourse studies, discourse theory, and corpus linguistics is particularly useful here. And so I've included this cover of Time magazine from 2018, when it was kind of peak Salvini, I guess, which provides a key example of how the mainstream is complicit in platforming and normalizing far-right ideas. But also Salvini's going back to his self-depiction as populist, and more recently his representation of his politics as common sense, has also contributed to providing the discursive space for the election of Italy's most right-wing government since World War II in the September 2022 snap elections. And I'm just going to finish on this slide here because while Salvini's and the Lega's popularity on the far right of Italian politics has waned drastically in recent years, he's polling below even Forza Italia at the moment, his depiction of reactionary politics as common sense has opened up this space for Giorgia Meloni and her Brothers of Italy party to thrive and be increasingly accepted as part of the mainstream. This government coalition is the latest iteration of an alliance of parties which since 1994 have been referred to euphemistically as a centre-right coalition, even if it has contained both the Lega, Berlusconi's party, which can hardly be described as centre-right, I would argue, and also the different iterations of the neo-fascist Italian social movement, or MSI. Meloni has shown herself to be a much shrewder political operator than Salvini in many ways, and therefore possesses an arguably even greater threat to those at greatest risk from far-right ideology. And so I would argue that any definition of the far right should hold racism at its core, while also taking note of how it overlaps with other forms of exclusion. It's only by doing this that we can understand how many of the racist ideas which the Lega has amplified in the near 40 years of its existence have become increasingly mainstream. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, George. I'm amazed at how both of you have managed to stick to the 15 minutes. I thought that would be impossible, but actually, yeah, we could have had 4 speakers and it would have worked out. So yeah, thank you both so much for keeping to time, and it's a great presentation as always, George. Remember, you can ask us questions in the Q&A. It's working. So yeah, the chat is closed, but if you have comments rather than questions, please do put them in the Q&A as well. So our final speaker for today is Miranda Iossifidis, who is from Newcastle University and will be talking to us about her chapter on ecofascism, far-right ecologism, and neo-Malthusianism. Miranda, the floor is yours. And we can see your slides, by the way, so it's all good.
Cool. Hi, yeah, thank you. Don't know if I'm going to fit in 15 minutes, but I'm going to give it a go. Thanks. It's great to be part of this book with so many interesting, provocative contributions, and thanks for having me here today. I'm going to summarize this chapter, which is really an overview of contemporary debates, really. So it probably won't be anything new to folks who research these topics, but in response to the editors of this book calling for discussion of terminology in researching the far right, I focus on far-right responses to climate crisis rather than skepticism or denialism, and the ways in which interdisciplinary scholars, writers, and activists work with concepts of ecofascism, far-right ecologism, green nationalism, and neo-Malthusianism. And I draw on this work to argue that the interrelation of white supremacist ideology, racial capitalism, and heteropatriarchy must be central to our analysis, and we have to take ecofascism seriously in spite of its diverse usage as a political myth which is increasingly evident in mainstream political discourse. And here I draw on the work of Chiara Buttici on political myth. So political myths take the kernel of historical narratives and ground them in contemporary significance, containing within them a determination to act on the present. And so, in other words, political myths have concrete cultural and material effects. And as Moore and Roberts note in their recent book on the rise of ecofascism, the far right can't be treated as an aberrant force external to and preying on wider society, but as a most extreme part of a distribution involved in a complicated dance with the rest of society. So this links back to Omran's talk, I think. So focusing on ecofascism as political myth-making helps us to identify and analyze the ways in which environmental narratives are mobilized by varied actors to provide contemporary significance to far-right concerns, and it also speaks to and names anti-fascist eco-anxieties around climate presence and futures. And we have to remain attentive to how, as a term that coalesces a cluster of discourses, ecofascism can help us identify specific tropes of far-right ecologism and their mainstreaming within right-wing and liberal environmentalism in diverse cultural, political, and social settings. So I'm also going to shout out the Katie Brown, Aurelia Mondon, and Aaron Winter article. So, and this also resonates with April Anson's and Indita Banerjee's exploration of ecofascism as an ongoing, metamorphosing politics of proximity in the places and practices of everyday life. So that entails rescaling it from a hypervisible series of unthinkable acts into a method and practice for negotiating a planetary eschaton of degradation and extinction. So being attentive to ecofascist political myth-making requires an anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-neo-Malthusian, intersectional feminist approach, that centers reproductive, environmental, and climate justice. So the chapter first outlines current conceptualization of ecofascism and far-right ecologism before moving on to a discussion of the centrality of neo-Malthusian images and tropes in contemporary far-right ecological discourses, as well as liberal environmentalism, focusing specifically on populationism and bordering practices. So, I've got two screens, which is not always helpful. Ecofascism and far-right ecologism. So the Out of the Woods Collective, if you don't know their work, look them up, it's great, defined ecofascism as the use of ecological crisis by the far right to justify actions of extreme violence, necropolitics, and racial cleansing. And we can also draw on Moore and Roberts' approach, where they consider contemporary far-right configurations as a spectrum, including political parties and emerging environmental authoritarianism, as well as young far-right and fascist movements and eco-fascist terrorists. And for Bernard, Faulkner, and Balsalubada, who have a vast literature really useful on this if you're new to the topic, ecofascism as a term doesn't allow for discussion of the complexity and breadth of the intersection of the far right and the environment. So they identify far-right ecologism as a more useful lens. But I think if we use Moore and Roberts' spectrum, regardless of terminology, what matters for both far-right ecologists and ecofascists in a given ecology is particular racial blood ties, under whose spell all forms of domination and solidarity must work. So in recent years, we've seen ecofascism discussed more widely across different media and work that straddles academic, activist, and accessible formats. And there was a recent interactive comic by the Anti-Creep Climate Initiative Collective called Against the Ecofascist Creep, Debunking Ecofascist Myths, which engages with mainstream popular media and details 6 everyday ecofascist myths and has accompanying discussion topics, tactics, strategies. And this speaks to what Moore and Roberts call the eco-fascist hypothesis, which is the widespread anxiety that our political future might be eco-fascism. So taking climate anxiety and speculative eco-fascist futures seriously, I extend this argument to consider eco-fascism a political myth, which focusing on this means like an ongoing process comprised of images, figures, speculative and characters, which is useful both in terms of describing the politics of climate anxieties about speculative futures, and for anti-fascist research that can identify necropolitical, violent, racist action and discourse deployed in the name of ecological crisis. So you could look at the work of Red Flare in the UK, for example, who do this kind of important work. So in the chapter, I then outlined some aspects of Janet Biel and Peter Staudenmayer's book, Ecofascism Revisited, Lessons from the German Experience, which is also really great, and traces ecofascism's antecedents and details what they call the peculiar synthesis of naturalism and nationalism forged under the influence of the Romantic traditions, anti-Enlightenment in rationalism, through 19th century figures and their influence on the Volkisch movement, and how the emergence of modern ecology brought together aggressive nationalism, mystically charged racism, and environmental concerns. So from its very beginning, ecology has been bound up in a reactionary political framework. Ernst Haeckel, a German zoologist, was an enthusiastic supporter of eugenicism, coined the term ecology in 1867, and was a chief popularizer of Darwin and evolutionary theory in the German-speaking world. And the relationship between spirituality, organicism, and naturalism, epitomized in eco-fascist discourse by Richard Walter Darrow's infamous proclamation and popularization of the slogan "Blood and Soil," has an even longer history circulating in Volkisch circles since the Romantic era. However, as Malman and the Zedkin Collective point out, there's contradictions in this, and they note that not even the Nazi theorist with the greenest reputation could avoid flipping brown naturalism into a project for actual domination of nature. And they say that historiography refutes the myth of green Nazism, acknowledging that what did exist was a measure of nature-related rhetoric, and that they argue that Biel and Staudenmayer's interest in bestowing green diplomas on Nazism stems from their fight to drive reactionaries out of the environmental movement of the 80s and 90s, which is important in themselves, and their book is great if you've not read it. So these historical and conceptual foundations of ecofascism nonetheless remain important for contemporary analysis of far-right ecologism, as they form part of a lexicon which continues to offer intellectual sustenance for both far-right and liberal environmentalism. And there's this great article by Max Agel and Lisa Tilley on this. So for Balsa Lubada, ecofascism may be inadequate to capture the breadth of discourses on the natural environment coming from far-right actors. And he sets out a framework to explore the nexus of far-right ecologism for prospective empirical research, which is quite useful. And his morphology of far-right ecologism brings together naturalism, spirituality and mysticism, organicism and autarky, authority, nostalgia, and Manichaeanism. And he argues that whilst invoking ecofascism might seem conducive to preventing the proponents of such worldviews from permeating the mainstream, contemporary far-right ecological values are too complex and elusive to be reduced to neo-fascism. So I think this is an important point. However, rather than reducing the complexities of far-right ecologism to ecofascism, I want to propose understanding of ecofascism as a collection of images, tropes, and motifs that form part of political myth-making, composed of these kernels of narratives that are found in a diversity of settings, which an approach that entails engaging with anti-fascist research and activism, and a portable concept of fascism that makes these dangers legible, so that the term, as it is used in situ, goes towards helping us identify distinct formulations of the far right's use of climate crisis for violent and racist ends. And here I'm drawing on Paxton's conceptualization of fascism that emphasizes temporal processes and social relations, as well as Ellie's proclamation that we should concern ourselves with the production of fascist potentials and be alert to the crisis, the kind of crisis where a politics that begins to look like fascism can coalesce. And one crucial way in which the far right has long sought to use ecological crisis as a means for necropolitical ends is through the notion of population, which is inseparable from neo-Malthusianism. So I'm now going to focus on some speculative eco-fascist presents and futures which hold neo-Malthusianism at their core. So that's the second section that I've got listed here, neo-Malthusianism and populationism. So contemporarily, we can see various populationisms being mobilized in myriad ways, which render humanity abstract and relative by placing it in opposition to nature or the economy. And here I'm really drawing on the work of feminist scholars such as Jade Sasser, Diana Ojeda, Anne Hendrickson, Sarojini Nambali, and Ellen E. Foley, who have got a lot of really cool work on this, who argue that these binaries identify problems of surplus or scarcity that then provide a logic of remediation and a rationale for intervening in ways that conceal and reinforce systems of power and inequality. And this is evident in what Farhana Sultana calls the homogenizing tendencies of an undifferentiated we in common climate discourse, whereby those experiencing climate impacts more violently are often also rendered less than human. And this revival of neo-Malthusianism in mid to late 20th century is well documented, so I'm not going to go into it. But more recent feminist work is kind of drawing on the fact that they've long understood populationism as being embedded in this depoliticizing statistical knowledge production and inextricably tied to the social Darwinist, colonial, racist rationalities and histories. So whilst this trope of the population bomb might be diminishing, you can trace the shifts in language around population control and policy back to the ICPD in Cairo 94, whereby the language assumptions and norms supporting population control were supplanted by those supporting reproductive rights and health. And more recently, it's about reproductive justice. So you can see the work of Jade Sasser to go more into how that's being appropriated. So there's this kind of troubling contemporary embeddedness with different attachments of population in different settings. So you can see we have this kind of intersection of populationism, reproductive rights, and climate change politics. And here neo-Malthusianism is sort of as a kernel of ecofascism can help us to identify racist, violent, I'm going too fast. Necropolitical rationalities and narratives that are pernicious. So I guess if you want to say what the overarching aim of the chapter is, it's kind of like, how can we identify these really violent, necropolitical, pernicious discourses, practices that are all around us, deeply, deeply embedded. So you can find them not only in the explicitly racist version of right-wing ecofascism, but they also permeate apparently unpolitical mainstream technocratic environmental data politics, as well as birth strike climate activism, post-human feminist agendas. So these feminist scholars caution us that scholarship that secures population control within a closed narrative of the past really forecloses the possibility of recognizing how populationist thinking and interventions persist. And they point towards these three new forms of populationism, which have kind of focused on optimizing numbers, so demopopulationism, spaces, geopopulationism, and life itself, biopopulationism, which they argue have emerged in response to the anticipated effects of climate change and unsustainable development. And racism is really central to this construction of overpopulation as an environmental problem and white supremacist notions of extinction and replacement. So in the late 20th century, scientists' use of race as a language was replaced with population as a term that was seemingly devoid with claims to racial difference. But we could see that this persists, and notions of overpopulation are central to not only the right and far right, but as Tilly and Asia argue, to liberal environmentalism as the arena for effectively laundering white nationalist priorities into policy-oriented analyses and proposed solutions in response to the urgency of climate change. And these concerns of population are also tied to violent bordering practices, which I'm going to now turn to very quickly. So soil, land, and eco-bordering. So the racialized, gendered, and class dynamics of colonialism are fundamental to any contemporary understanding of nature and environment, as well as any form of green nationalism, whereby protection of the white nation is protection of nature, and the ecological crisis, as Malman and Zetkin Collective say, is not denied but enlisted as a reason to fortify borders and keep aliens out. So here, neo-Malthusianism and the mysticism of national nature come together in the form of contemporary green nationalism, and we can see the far-right ecological lineage of Haeckel and Darre continues to find a contemporary home in the synthesis of naturalism and nationalism, which, as Lubada says, takes the form of yearning for natural borders and long-lost territories. And then I sort of briefly discussed the intersection of soil, land, colonialism, and nationalism, which takes on particular contours in a UK context, so a sort of interwar organo-fascist vision of a culturally homogenous nation or race emerging, depending on the soil and the identity coming from it, protecting national biodiversity tied to racism is this common recurring thread in the 80s and 90s with the National Front. And then in the mid to late 2010s, the BNP claiming to be the only true Green Party of Britain, due to their neo-Malthusian logic that they alone recognize that overpopulation, whose primary driver is immigration, in their words, is the cause of the destruction of our environment. Nigel Farage also drew on it. You know, they called for the protection of our precious countryside for future generations. And we see this trend across Europe. And more recently, fascist group in the UK, Patriotic Alternative, have been doing community building involving camping and hiking in the countryside, rather than the sort of large-scale demonstrations pursued by street movements in the 2010s. And again, you can see the work of Red Flare for more on that. And there's another chapter in the book that discusses this. So at a European level, in response to growing environmental concerns, Faulkner argues that many European right-wing parties have focused anew on climate change, turning away from previous skepticism and denialism. And here we see some more contemporary formulations of eco-fascist neo-Malthusianism and colonial discourses. And I really love this paper by Turner and Bailey on eco-bordering. So they think this is like a new environmental discourse emerging from European far-right parties, and that kind of amplifies nationalist concerns at a European scale, kind of engendering fears about the supposedly active threat of immigration to previously pure and sustainable spaces of national nature. So borders become forms of environmental protection, and they identify two kind of major expressions of this discourse. So there's migration as environmental plunder, and the second expression is the migrant as environmental vandal. So Fortress Europe, with ever more technologically sophisticated and securitized borders, becomes a calculative response designed to both cultivate and supposedly soothe climate anxieties, knotted in mystical formulations of blood and soil, ethno-nationalism, and neo-Malthusianism. And in Turner and Bailey's analysis, eco-bordering is the sanitation and reworking of eco-fascist and colonial logics of race, and a means of obscuring capitalist processes underpinning ecological crisis and degradation, precisely to formulate a discourse that is designed to engender fears around human mobility. So I'm just going to conclude. I think that speculative eco-fascist presence and futures are important to engage with, despite or perhaps because of sensationalist media coverage giving fascists more airtime, precisely because ecological anxieties and political myths have cultural and material effects. The different kernels that I've briefly engaged with here interlink and cluster in the form of narratives and discourse that provide meaning and significance for diverse actors, forming really dangerous and violent constellations in the name of urgent climate crisis. And as such, we need to be attentive to the pernicious ideas as they emerge in different places, including the aesthetic forms and performative practices, which are fertile breeding grounds, as Anton and Banerjee say, for cultural imaginations and political imaginaries that can provide both insights and interruptions to eco-fascist alarming naturalization across the world. The far right will continue to take advantage of the deepening of the climate crisis globally, as well as everyday climate anxiety. And so as such, we can anticipate the amplification of violent, racist and necropolitical concerns coalescing around the intersection of reproduction, population, borders and migration, all in the name of the environment. And whatever conceptual terminology we use, I think we have to be able to identify, critique and contest eco-fascist, far-right and neo-Malthusian expressions and the mobilization of these discursive tropes wherever they emerge. This entails stating our antagonists clearly, creating and sharing accessible resources, working with anti-fascist, anti-racist, feminist groups and spaces, and learning from and with reproductive, environmental, and climate justice movements in order to collectively imagine, create, and act upon different environmental presence and futures. So that's
Brilliant.
Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Miranda, for this really, really interesting talk, and so much to think about. I'll stop the recording now for the Q&A.